So Jews, on the one hand, Jews will enjoy the privileges of whiteness. So Ashkenazi Jews will enjoy the privileges of whiteness, and at the same time are being targeted with violence by those people who are the most invested in some quote-unquote white identity.
How do you all both handle that personally?
This was one of the most interesting things to me about teaching at Fisk for so long, was that I think it's very rare for white people, Jewish, non-Jewish white people in America, to be in a room where they're the only one in the room.
Whiteness is not an identity that I embrace. I recognize that I benefit from privileges, right? That being categorized as white confers on me, right? So I own that.
Right.
But in terms of the identity that's important to me, it's the Jewish identity. And the notion of whiteness erases that.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Slice of the Community. I'm your host, Jerome Moore. Today, I'm with Dr. Meyer and Dr. Kelner from Vanderbilt University, who are both professors in the Jewish Studies Department at Vanderbilt University, for our discussion here around Black and Jewish relations. Thank you all for being here. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for having us.
I just want to preface it this way. Me and Dr. Kelner, we had amazing sidebar conversation at the United States and the Holocaust, which is kind of like the catalyst to this conversation. And with our conversation, it just opened up the whole nother world for me around just Black and Jewish relations. What does that mean? What does it look like? The history, the controversy, the allyship. So hopefully we can just dive into that and go straight into it. So I'll start with you, Dr. Meyer. Racism and anti-Semitism. How would you describe both of those being separate and similar?
I think in many ways they're very similar. The impulse for someone who is an anti-Semite or a racist is the same impulse, to denigrate the other, to promote yourself by putting somebody else down. That general impulse, I think, is the same in all kinds of anti-whatever movements. It's obviously in America that the degree has been different. The way in which African Americans have been mistreated in America is greater than the degree to which Jews have been mistreated in America. But the impetus behind that mistreatment, I would say, is the same.
Okay, Dr. Kelner.
Well, when anti-Semites are attacking Jewish people or Jewish buildings, they're not stopping us first to ask whether we observe the kosher laws and don't eat pork, or we observe the Sabbath. You know, it's not based on religious grounds. They're targeting us because they see us as Jews, whether we identify as Jews or not, and in that sense, it's something that they're ascribing. If you go outside of the States and you think about the different ways that Jews have been othered, persecuted, oppressed, there have been contexts in which Jews have been persecuted on religious grounds. They were the wrong religion. There have been times and places where they've been persecuted on racial grounds and actually defined as a separate race and murdered because of that. And obviously, the Holocaust is the classic example of that. But if we think about anti-Semitism and prejudice, there are ways in which anti-Semitism and racism, there are ways in which anti-Semitism is a form of racism. There are ways in which it's different from it as well. And if you think about the ways, even that the Jewish community will talk about anti-Semitism, the Anti-Defamation League, for example, will talk about the number of anti-Semitic incidents. We talk about anti-Semitism in terms of something that you can count, incident by incident. We generally don't talk about racism in the States in terms of incidents. We talk about it as systemic and structural. And I think that we could pull back and we can talk about systemic structural dimensions to anti-Semitism historically and globally too, even though in the States we usually don't.
And I wonder if we usually don't, because it's hard for me to say, you all are Jewish, right? It's easy for someone to look at me and say, you're Black, right? So when someone goes out their way to participate in being anti-Semitism, they have to do some digging. They have to identify, for definitely know, like, okay, that person is Jewish. Where on the surface of a person of color, being an African American, I was like, okay, I can just be just racist because I can definitely tell. I wonder how does that play into the experience? And I'll start with you, Dr. Kelner.
Well, Dr. Meyer can speak to some of this better than I can about white passing and the like. There are Look, there are ways in which Eastern European Ashkenazi Jews are thought to have stereotypic Jewish looks. And it's interesting when you think about what the Nazis did. They thought that they could spot Jews very clearly, and yet they had to come up with a whole way of categorizing, where if one grandparent is Jewish, why? Because they couldn't tell.
Right.
So Jewishness is not a race, and yet it often gets talked about in terms of distinctive Jewish looks or behavior. I'm speaking with my hands right now. That's considered sometimes distinctive Jewish behavior. You know, so these things, they blend. But Jews have the ability well, we should talk about white passing. It gets into really, really complex questions about Jews and whiteness, and I think that can actually open us up to that.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. My experience with my students at Fisk was that there was no distinction made between white people and Jews. Right. I had been at Fisk for probably 10 years before I first taught a course in Black-Jewish relations, and students, several of whom I had already had in classes, were very surprised to learn that I was Jewish. And at that point in time, I'm talking in the 1990s, early 2000s, that distinction between Jews and other white people had kind of disappeared. Whereas in earlier time periods within the African community, there was a distinction made. I was telling Professor Kelner, the fact that there's a separate slang term, Goldberg, for Jews than there is for white people, au-faits or whatever, indicates that there's some difference, that African Americans see some difference. Now, whether that's a positive or negative, but they did see Jews as different than other white people. But I don't know that that's the case anymore. I think most people looking at Ashkenazic white Jews see them as white people.
I never thought that even the term like white Jews could be kind of cringing. Like, do I want to be associated with whiteness, you know, because of the history of just elite whites and what happened, kind of the persecution they put on Jews here, even in the United States, right? Up in the East, New York and all those areas. And so that just fascinated me. Like, wow, you know, even though when I look at the census, like 92% of Jews, you know, classify themselves as white, you know, and okay, how does that balance then? When you walk into a room as a Jew, but you're white, everybody else is seeing you as probably white, right? But in your heart and your mind, it's like, no, I'm not. But it goes to that point too, well, is being a Jew a race? You know, it makes it complex for someone looking out outside in, but then to hear you say, well, it's definitely not a race.
Well, there are Jews in all races.
Yeah.
There are Jews in India, look like people in India. There are Jews in China, look like people in China. There are Jews in Africa. So if you break race categories the way I learned as a kid into those three categories, Jews are in all three. So it doesn't work.
So I want to get Dr. Meyer's opinion on this. Classifying it as white Jew, because we know there's black Jews, you know. How does that make you feel? How does that initially hit you when I say, yeah, you know, if I said black and white Jewish relations?
I guess that's mostly what I deal with is in my courses is those interactions. I think, again, in America, most Jews are Ashkenazic Jews who are white. Sometimes part of the problem between the two communities is that some people will take advantage of that, will use their whiteness as a way of promoting themselves, as a way of integrating themselves into whatever community they want to be in by removing themselves and denigrating themselves from some other community. I find that problematic.
Jewishness is categorized as whiteness here in the States at this present moment. And in different places and different times, it's been categorized differently. So if I look at the ship arrival records from my immigrant ancestors who came over under race and people, it says Hebrew there. And this is in English in a document that the U.S. government is using. It's 100 and some odd years old. Now, at the same time, Jews in the South were drinking from fountains that were labeled as white. So they were categorized by the government for those purposes as white. So the Jews' relationship to whiteness is, there's ambivalence, but it's not a totally fixed category. And when you think about the massacre at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, and this is by an avowed white nationalist, white supremacist, who targeted Jews and did not see them as white. So Jews, on the one hand, Jews will enjoy the privileges of whiteness. So Ashkenazi Jews will enjoy the privileges of whiteness, and at the same time, are being targeted with violence by those people who are the most invested in some quote-unquote white identity.
How do you all deal with that in everyday life, walking into those rooms? And what are some of those things that you possibly may feel or don't feel? Or what maybe some of those advantages you have or don't have?
This was one of the most interesting things to me about teaching at Fisk for so long, was that I think it's very rare for white people, Jewish, non-Jewish white people in America, to be in a room where they're the only one in the room. And I was in that situation every day for years. And it affects, I come to see how a black person would feel being the only one in a room, being the only white person in the room. Whether it's white, Jewish or not, I don't think, again, that distinction makes that much difference.
Right.
I'm not a religious person. I consider being Jewish more like an ethnicity.
Okay.
But I think that I certainly am not trying to deny it or anything like that, but I'm not outwardly telling people, hey, I'm a Jew.
Right. Have you seen any change in people's behaviors towards you once they find out that you're a Jew? Have you ever experienced that? Okay.
I don't think so.
Dr. Kendall?
Whiteness is not an identity that I embrace. I recognize that I benefit from privileges, right? That being categorized as white confers on me, right? So I own that.
Right.
But in terms of the identity that's important to me, it's the Jewish identity. And the notion of whiteness erases that. And if you think about Jewishness as a form of white passing, the whiteness is something that renders the Jewishness invisible. It's part of the assimilation of Jews into the States. But this is a culture that is important to me to maintain. And part of having it maintained is not just me identifying with it, but having it recognized by others as this is a distinct culture. So it's an awkward and an ambivalent position, and also it's problematic because I do not want to affirm, I don't believe, and I really think it's dangerous also, to say that Jewishness is a race. It's in the blood, it's in the biology. And I have a lot of problems with the DNA testing where people will say, oh, I'm 93% Ashkenazi Jewish. It's you know, we after the Holocaust, we managed to expunge a racial discourse about Jews from American talking about Jews. That's come back in the conversation, and it's dangerous and it's problematic. So how do I, right, as someone who I'm categorized as white, I enjoy the privileges of whiteness, I am Jewish, I identify with the Jewishness, and I want to preserve this. How do I, in the States, manage to maintain and project an identity that says I am I want another category. I want another category, and I don't. And a duality is problematic.
Is that a conversation within the Jewish community? Like, how do you do that? How does it happen? When I go to fill out whether it's a job application, right? I don't see Jewish on there. See, you know, African American, Caucasian, Hispanic, Latinx, and then the other maybe. But so are you writing in Jewish, or are you checking white, Caucasian?
The last census for the race question, I checked white. But for the country of origin question, I wrote Jews. My mother's parents are both from Romania. It means absolutely nothing to me to be Romanian. Because they weren't really Romanian in Romania, they were Jews. So whether the government accepted that as a legitimate answer or not, I don't know, but that's what I wrote.
I want to go into the history a little bit. Which you all are more experts than me on in general, but I want to go into the history between just black and Jewish relations, and I want to start with the allyship, right? And then kind of work our way to how do we get to the tension, the adversarial things that we kind of see present day. We know that there was coalition building around the civil rights, around the anti-Nazi movement. Can you all speak to that a little bit and paint that picture for us on how those relations really looked during those times, even though that we know Germany was looking at the Jim Crow, looking at the one drop of blood rule, and then putting together their whole, you know, grandmother, grandfather, their whole listing of what classifies a person as Jewish in Germany. Can you break that down?
So the history of allyship goes back actually before the war in some degrees. Jews, for example, were co-founders of the NAACP. Jews had been working with for African-American causes before the war. But I think the war really kind of brought home to both groups the way in which the extent to which anti-Semitism, racism, the extent to which it can proceed. And so I think African-Americans and Jewish Americans both were brought sort of to understand the need to work together to prevent that from happening. And so from the mid-50s or so on, we have what is generally seen to be this grand alliance between the black community and the Jewish community, where you have so many Jewish students, for example, during the Mississippi Summer, Freedom Summer. You have so many Jews marching at Selma, Rabbi Heschel most notably, but lots of Jews. Jews working on Supreme Court cases, on Brown v. Board, for example. So there was a great deal of allyship, generally seen as being a kind of because of mutual self-interest, that the two groups were both fighting for the same things and so they could help each other out.
Right.
By the late 60s, it seems as though they're not fighting for the same things anymore. And so they start turning against each other. The affirmative action cases in the early 70s is one of the big breaks. The Six-Day War in Israel, oddly enough, created a big break within the two communities. And so from that point on, from the late 60s on, it was seen to be this kind of dissolving relationship.
And so do you think that assimilation of whiteness played a part into that?
I think so. I think so. James Baldwin has a famous essay called "Negroes are anti-Semitic, because they are anti-white." And his argument is that when we criticize Jewish people, it's because they're acting white, and that we expected something. This is one of the great causes of tension between the two communities. Baldwin says we expected something different from Jews than we expected from white people.
Right.
And so when we didn't get it, it created bitterness and animosity and anger it comes out as anti-Semitism.
Right.
Because we expected, and the same thing is true in reverse. We expected these people had been in a similar situation, they would have empathy, we could work together, and when that doesn't happen, then it creates more animosity than it would be if you weren't expecting anything in the first place.
The social constructs around that, right? How does that play, just the United States and the race, and understanding that, yeah, you're Jewish, I'm black, however, again, the system sees you as white and me black, therefore you're gonna get certain economic privileges, social privileges, political privileges that I don't see. Even though, yeah, we supposed to be in this fight together, but however, you know, this social construct is uplifting you a little bit and keeping me here.
Yeah, and the two communities have expectations of each other. Both have self-understandings that look back to histories of oppression, look back to histories of slavery.
Right.
The key difference, though, is that for the black community, that history is here in this country.
Right.
And for Jews, it's much longer, before, but it's somewhere else.
Right.
And so even though there's this point of connection, there's a key difference. And in some ways, it's the inability of the two communities to recognize the difference within the similarity that causes the splits. Because we imagine more similarity than there is, and then when we discover that there's not, then there's disappointment. Right. And so, like, being honest about that with each other is I think one of the keys to managing that and building a healthy alliance.
Right.
Paul Berman has an interesting essay called "The Other and the Almost the Same," and he argues that when two groups are completely other, they can get along because they're not fighting, they're not conflicting about anything. But when two groups are very close together, the differences become magnified between the two. So the other, it's more difficult to get along with the almost the same than it is with the complete other.
We talk about these expectations, and I think this is important because even if you just go online right now and you type in, black, Jewish relations, conflicts, or whatever, a lot of times, in my own personal experience, it's always either black people talking about it, or black people talking about it, really. Like, I rarely see Jewish people as a community, let's say scholars maybe, but I rarely see Jewish people calling that out in an adversarial way or blaming that I see from the black American community from my perspective.
I wonder how much we're all locked in our own media bubbles. And you're seeing stuff that's going on. You're seeing a black conversation.
Yeah.
I'm seeing a Jewish conversation, right? And I don't know if it's never the twain shall meet, but how do we break out of our own echo chambers to
Right.
see what are the conversations that other communities are having. So this type of conversation is
It's-
great.
yeah,
We can do that.
Right, exactly. So what are some of those conversations, I guess, that are happening that y'all are part of or that you all see?
So I think in the Jewish community, there is a lamenting, there's a nostalgia for, I think, what's imagined to be a golden day of a Black-Jewish alliance.
Okay.
And a lamenting for its passing.
Okay.
I think that's a common trope in Jewish conversations about Black-Jewish relations. And senses on the Jewish side in terms of expectations, a sense of upset when when Jews experience anti-Semitism from the Black community, a sense of upset.
Okay.
We would expect it from those with white privilege.
Right.
Right? But Blacks know what it's like to be discriminated against. Why would there be prejudice in the Black community? So it's
Right.
that sense of expectation and lament. And I will say probably less introspection as to how more of a sensitivity to having been wronged than to having wronged.
Right.
Right. And that's where the actual dialogue is beneficial because, oh, well, these things go in both directions.
Yeah.
Absolutely, they go both ways. That's the point I was going to make. That what you say about the Jewish community is reflected also in the Black community, if I could speak for them. The sense that, that from the Jewish perspective, there's a sense in certain circles that we did all these things for the Black community and then they've turned against us. And I think that to some degree there's the same thing in the Black community.
Right.
You guys were with us, when we were helping each other.
Right.
But now when something comes up that's going to help us that might hurt you a little bit,
Right.
then you turn against us.
Right. And I think from the Black community's perspective, we see our duties, especially during the civil rights, is propelling all minorities. Right. We've done something that had the attitude. If it wasn't for the leap that we took, where would other minorities be? What would they have? And then we see like, well, all these other minorities get this white privilege that we don't get at all. And so where's our support from that angle? And I think that's what also brings tension in. And I want to go to these stereotypes and generalizations that I know I was brought up on the Jewish community, as far as like wealth, media controlling, even the NAACP, right? I've heard that being used as like, well, the Jews control the Blacks because they funded the NAACP.
Right.
Even that is contentious within the Black community for whatever reason. But that's the lens that I was even brought up under when we're talking about the Jewish community, right? And I guess that's, anti-Semitism that I was hearing, right? But as I had told Dr. Kendall on our side conversation, if, for example, if Kanye West, Ye, was to say, white man control media, everybody, oh yeah, that's accurate. A white man control Hollywood. Oh, okay, it's accurate. But when you put on the Jewish title onto it, it changes the conversation.
Yeah.
What are y'all's thoughts on that?
Some of it is a question of what you mean by controlling.
Right.
Right. Do Jews disproportionately own major Hollywood studios and major record companies, et cetera, et cetera? Sure.
Right.
But does that mean that they have complete control? I would argue not. There's a history of Jews having difficulty getting representation on television, particularly, even up through like Seinfeld. He had a hard time getting that show on TV because the network said, well, people in Iowa aren't going to get it. It's too New York, right?
New York is code for Jewish.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, New York is
To
code
New
for
York.
Jewish.
That's why I went like this.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, I didn't know that. Yeah.
And obviously it was a big hit. So if the Jews control the media, why does this Jew have a problem getting a show on TV?
Right.
Right. So I have a problem with the word control.
Okay. What go ahead.
We should go back
Yeah.
deeper in time because these things these are tropes that are prevalent now.
Right.
These are things that you heard growing up. These are things that I heard growing up as these are anti-Semitic stereotypes. You'll know them when you hear them. But they have a history. They didn't start when we were kids. They
Right.
start a long time, and they didn't start in the States. And this is where I had said earlier, we don't talk about anti-Semitism in systemic structural terms.
Yeah.
But if you go historically, you could, and you can think about how for the past 1,500 years or so, the Western world's basically divided between two religious civilizational empires. You have Christendom and you have Islam.
Right.
And in both cases, Jews are a minority in both of these halves of the world. And in both instances, the dominant religious group decided that they had the right to decide what privileges Jews should or shouldn't have.
Okay.
And not rights, just privileges. So among the, now, modern period where Jews in the States and in other places have succeeded economically, politically, and the like, this notion of how can this group that has been historically oppressed, historically marginalized, historically did not have the right to say, these are our rights, only could ask for privileges. How is it that this group has succeeded? And so a whole host of conspiracy theories sprung up around it. Jewish control, at the heart of it is this notion that whatever type of success Jews have had, be it political, be it economic, it is ill-gotten. It's nefarious. They don't deserve it. So it's not just Jewish wealth. It's Jewish greed. Right? It's not just Jewish empowerment. It's Jewish conspiracy. And so these tropes, or the classic tropes, and the most popular, most successful conspiracy theory in the world, and published so many times, has been the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion. You know, the cover of some of these publications have drawings of Jews as octopus or spiders with tentacles or weaving webs. It's a hoax. It purports to be a story of a Jewish conspiracy.
Not too different from the tropes and the propaganda that was done to blacks here in the United States.
So, but these tropes die hard.
I want to say in the entertainment before we move on right quick. I just want you all's personal opinion on this. Anti-blackness, right? Some would say hip hop in itself is at the current moment, modern moment, is very anti-black. But if you look at who is putting just controlling this music, right? A lot of people will point to the Jews because it seems like they are the majority owners of these record labels that are permitting young, predominantly black men to put this music out, right? But so this music can be degrading to black people, degrading to women, right? Very anti-black, which is okay. People are consuming it. It's okay to sell. It's no problem. Life goes on, right? You have Kyrie Irving make a post about a movie that happens to be, you know, anti-Semitic to Jews, blows up. It's a huge deal, right? And so I bring this thing up is when something is anti-black, you know, things kind of go by, no feathers are ruffled, little to no consequences. But when the Jewish community is attacked, this is from my black lens also, we see swift action. What are y'all thoughts on that? Do you all agree? Do you all see that like in life itself when it comes to those two groups? And is it because of the black-white assimilation dynamic? You seem like you're itching. You like you're itching.
I think people are inclined to see their own oppression more than that of others. And they're inclined to feel it more acutely. You know, it's for obvious reasons. And I get caught in seeing things only from their point of view. So if you take, for example, let's go back a few weeks or months before the Kyrie Irving to the Kanye West Ye posts. Now, I am not a supporter of cancel culture. I'm just simply acknowledging that we are living in a cultural moment where this is a common thing, where people are getting canceled and they're losing jobs and they're, for things that they say. Okay, I do not support this. But among the things that the American Jewish community noticed was when someone of Kanye West, Ye's wealth and power and fame made statements against the Jewish community, there was not immediate action. And it took a concerted effort on the Jewish community's part to push Adidas to cancel the contract. Now, Adidas has Nazi origins, right? And the fact that a company with Nazi origins is hemming and hawing about whether to call out anti-Semitism from its most prominent spokesman, because they had billions of dollars on the line. You know, and given that the trope is Jews have nefarious power, what's the Jewish community to do? So should they take the abuse, or should they fight back? And if they're successful in fighting back, for the anti-Semites, will that not confirm their belief that the power is right, that they have the power?
They have the power.
So it puts the Jewish community in a really, really difficult position. But Jews in that instance were aware of how long it took Adidas to do anything, and the discourse in the Jewish community was, if this was against any other group, if it was against blacks, if it was against women, if it was against the gay community, have you, they would have shut them down. They would have shut it down immediately. Right. But they were giving a pass because it was Jews, and Jews are perceived to be wealthy, and they're perceived to be white, even though the people shooting the synagogues don't believe so. Right? And therefore, it's okay to tolerate a little bit of anti-Semitism. But for the Jewish community, it's not okay to tolerate a little bit of anti-Semitism. It is intolerable.
I also think that Kanye and others understand how to get publicity. You say negative things about white people, the white press isn't going to notice. You say negative things about Jews, Jews are going to take notice, and they're going to make a protest, and they're going to say something. I think this was, Minister Farrakhan used this idea brilliantly. He knew he could get himself on the front page of the New York Times anytime he gave some speech railing against the Jews. So I think some of it is attaining your own notoriety by denigrating somebody else or some other group. I don't know if that's exactly what you would think. Kanye's popular enough, he doesn't need to do that. But I think it is a way of garnering publicity and of showing that you have a kind of toughness. You're willing to fight the power.
In this current moment, especially in like 21st century, right? How do we, especially in this time of like racial reckoning, how do we build, what social responsibility do we have as a black man and as Jewish man to come together and have these conversations, but what actions, what type of workable lists can we put together and do it collectively with both our communities to get at racism, anti-Semitism, better understanding each other's point of views when it comes to these things? Some people say, hey, nothing happens when blacks do it, or when it's against blacks, it doesn't happen fast enough, when something comes against Jews. As a black person, I'm not thinking about that. It's just not, that blew my mind, right? And so how do we, at this particular moment where we're gonna, as a black person, I'm gonna see you as white. I'm gonna just assume that you have all of that privilege. Therefore, the resources, the social, economic privileges, all goes to you all. How do we build and how can I see past that social conditioning, right? That's what it is, the indoctrination, right? Of that, and as a group to be able to build and understand how we build in the 21st century.
I don't think it's surprising as two professors that will say education. People need to learn. People need to learn about other communities. People need to understand why certain things are the way they are in those communities. I learned as much teaching at Fisk as the Fisk did. I hope they learned something from me, but I know I learned things from them. But it's exposure, it's being open and willing to understand where the other person, you don't have to agree with them, but you can understand why they're saying what they're saying. I think that kind of community interaction is really important.
Dr. Kelner?
I think empathy is key, and I think I said before about we're in our echo chambers and our media bubbles. It makes it really difficult to cultivate empathy, and and there's a severe deficit of that in society generally right now. We have to, and that's self-work, right? I think we have to work on that. But if we're only working on empathy, it's hard to work on empathy when you're doing it alone, right? And that's why communities need to be coming together. I think it's really important also to go into each other's spaces, to actually experience what it is like to be in Black community, in Jewish community. You'll learn things by seeing and being there that the dialogue alone, you may understand here, you will not understand here.
And I understood here, like I told you all, I went to my first Shabbat. Blew my mind. Didn't know it was gonna be so much food, but also the dialogue and the conversation. And it just helped me. And I know it helped other people that was at the Shabbat as well. But like doing that intentionally, right? And being brave to talk about these things in a civil space.
He mentioned the upcoming social justice Seder. This is a fairly common thing, not just in Nashville, but around the country, these social justice Seders. Because Passover, it seems to me, I've been working on a project about this, Passover, it seems to me, is the perfect opportunity for the two communities to come together. The Passover story, the book of Exodus, is the central story in African American history. And it's a Jewish story. So it seems a logical, natural place for these communities to come together and talk about moving forward, right? Coming from a similar past and moving forward. So these kinds of Seders are a particularly opportune time to talk about social justice issues, to talk about liberation and those kinds of things. I think the more African Americans are involved, the more those communications come across. Now, on the other hand, the Jews have certain responsibilities. I teach an essay by Letty Cotton Pogrebin, who was part of a feminist group, Black Jewish group, and they invited, she also was part of a group that was running a Seder, and they invited a Black group to come to the Seder. And when it came time for dinner, all the Black people said, oh, we're not hungry. We came to dinner before we came to the Seder. They didn't know that Seder included dinner. Well, somebody in the Jewish community should have told them that ahead of time. So it works both ways. Both groups have to kind of, what don't you know? What can I help you? How can I explain this to you?
The Seder is an instance in which Jews would be hosting Blacks in a Jewish space, right? And there's power differential between when there's a host and a guest, which is why it's also important to have reciprocity, right? And so what are the venues, what are the moments when Blacks are hosting Jews in Black spaces as well? So Blacks are the hosts and Jews are the guests.
Like I'm hosting you all.
Exactly.
As we tail off here, I want to give you all a chance to just hit on anything else that may be just at the front of your brain that you want to just leave the viewers home with around Black and Jewish relations. It's something they can just, leave on their minds and their hearts. I'll start with you, Doctor.
Okay. There is so much in common that unites the communities, and we forget that at our own peril.
One of the things I want to leave with my students is I ask them all the time, when two minority groups fight against each other, who wins? And they all say the majority. So that, I think, is right. And it's not just Blacks and Jews, it's all kinds of minority groups.
Exactly.
But it is in the best interest of the power structure to keep those groups fighting against each other. It's the best interest of those groups to work together to fight the power structure. But it's hard.
Well, look, I want to thank both of you all for coming here and being available to talk about this, very current, controversial topic around these two groups, but also necessary, I think, for community here. And hopefully we struck some chords and people to be invited or do the inviting to each of our communities and talk more about this and, again, do the work, do the action, because we have that history of coalition, allyship, and working to a greater cause. So thank you both.
Thank you.
And thank you all at home for watching another episode of A Slice of Community. See y'all next time.